All right, let's get started. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ziva Cooper to be our final keynote speaker for our 2022 conference. Dr. Cooper is the director of the UCLA Cannabis Research Initiative, Jane and Terry Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, and she is an associate professor of psychiatry at UCLA. Her research is funded by NIH and by the state of California, and she has published really important and clinically influential preclinical and clinical research on cannabinoids for pain, as well as sex differences in response to cannabinoids. She's emerged as a real leading voice in cannabis science, and it's our great pleasure to welcome her. Thank you so much for joining us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cooper.
Thank you. And it's really a wonderful opportunity to speak here, especially since I look to your center as constant inspiration. So I came to UCLA in 2019 to be the research director for this multidisciplinary initiative. And I'm happy to say that we have progressed to be a center. We're just working on our name and logo right now. So it's really exciting. And again, using the DeGroot CMCR as a model for what we can become is something that's always top of mind. So it's really wonderful to be here. Of course, I wish I was in person, but to close out this event is truly an honor. And I am going to be speaking today a little bit about research that we've completed and research that we have ongoing, looking at cannabinoids and cannabis constituents that might be helpful for pain. So looking past Delta-9-THC. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to see the questions in the chat bar, but it might be a little bit difficult. So I hope at the end we'll have time to talk about the content that I covered. So today, again, I'll be talking about cannabis constituents for pain, looking beyond Delta-9-THC. And what was already mentioned was that the funding that comes to support these studies really principally comes from the NIH, as well as the University of California, San Diego Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research that is California state funded. So we know that chronic pain is given as a top reason for using medical cannabis. This has been cited often, repeatedly over the last decade. And there's frequently conversation now that we're grappling with the opioid epidemic, if cannabis can help to cure the opioid crisis. Essentially, is it possible that cannabis can be used as an adjunct or a substitute to opioids for pain? There are many other reasons why cannabis and cannabinoids might be helpful when we talk about the opioid crisis, but I'll be mostly focusing on pain today. We know that there's really an urgent need to reduce prescription opioid reliance, and it is thought that there is potential for cannabis and cannabinoids. And why do we think that? We see these headlines all the time. So in part, there is evidence at the state level supporting that there are decreases in prescription opioid use in states, the United States, that have medical cannabis legalized. We know that there are several reports showing that medical cannabis users who are using cannabis for pain report eliminating opioid use. And in one particular study, they demonstrated that 72% of respondents were able to completely eliminate their opioid use, which is quite encouraging. Many medical cannabis users report decreased opioid use. So if they're not completely eliminating it, they've reported decreases in opioid use. And this comes from over 10 observational studies. However, other studies have demonstrated from a longitudinal level that sometimes pain patients who are using cannabis don't necessarily show improvements in pain. And in fact, some actually increase opioid use. And so that's quite concerning. So what's happening here? There's a lot of different sources of information, a lot of different types of study designs, a lot of population samples that are being queried to answer this question. And so today we'll talk a little bit about how we can design rigorous placebo-controlled studies to help answer this question, if cannabis can actually help or harm using opioids in the opioid epidemic. And so for a brief overview, first we'll talk about what is cannabis. And I know that I'm the last speaker for this event, so you've probably learned a lot about what cannabis is already. And I'll be talking about specific parts of the cannabis plant that are of interest to our laboratory. Next, I'll talk about THC, Delta-9-THC, as a potential substitute or adjunct to opioids for pain. Then I'll talk about some of the minor cannabinoids as well as terpenes, so these different chemicals in the cannabis plant. So first, let's talk about what is cannabis. So you've already learned throughout the last 2 days that cannabis has unique chemicals, of which there are about 120. We term these as phytocannabinoids, or cannabinoids for short. We know the most about Delta-9-tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. We know that there are adverse effects associated with THC, as we just learned, including intoxication, cognitive impairment. We know that the abuse liability and dependence that can happen when using cannabis repeatedly, we know that that is due to Delta-9-THC. We also know on the flip side that there are therapeutic potentials. There are therapeutic uses for Delta-9-THC. So there's kind of a yin and a yang here. We know that THC can help to increase appetite. It can also decrease nausea in certain pathological conditions. We also know, based off of many rigorous double-blind placebo-controlled studies, that it's helpful in reducing specific types of pain, although it is not in the United States FDA approved for that at this point. Cannabidiol, on the flip side, as you've learned, it is not intoxicating. It does not have abuse liability from what we can tell thus far. And from thus far, the studies that have been done, it does not seem to produce dependence, even after people are exposed to it at high doses for long periods of time. We know that it is therapeutic for certain seizure disorders. In the United States, CBD is approved for certain seizure disorders in the form of Epidiolex. We know that there are hints that cannabidiol might be helpful in reducing anxiety. And when I say evidence for that, I'm really referring to rigorous controlled trials, not surveys or patient reports. If you look at patient reports, undoubtedly people very much report that cannabidiol is helpful for their pain. Whether or not CBD is helpful, for anxiety, whether or not CBD is helpful for pain is a question that's kind of up in the air. Again, CBD, as you'll learn in a minute, CBD is used for pain quite frequently, and people report that it actually does help with pain. But if you look at the double-blind placebo-controlled studies, there really isn't good, strong evidence yet showing that CBD by itself is helpful for pain. There are many other constituents of the cannabis plant that are termed phytocannabinoids, and I'm just showing a couple of these here. These are a couple of cannabinoids that are really emerging in the market. For example, CBN, cannabinol, is thought to be helpful for sleep. CBDV is thought to be helpful for nausea or potential anti-seizure cannabinoid, as well as CBG, cannabigerol. And cannabigerol is a focus of some of our studies, or one study in our laboratory, where we know from preclinical studies that it seems like it might be helpful for pain in humans, and it might also help to increase appetite, which is important when looking at a clinical population that has chronic pain, because frequently decreases in appetite are associated with severity of pain. Interestingly, CBG, similar to CBD, in animals is shown to not be intoxicating or not have the same type of behavioral effects as THC. So there's some early hints in the preclinical literature and the animal literature showing that CBG might show promise for therapeutic use. Now in Los Angeles, as well as the United States, what we're seeing is that there's quite a few trends related to the use of these minor cannabinoids. There are vape pens, there are tinctures, there are topicals with these minor cannabinoids. And if you go into a dispensary, there are cannabinoids that I'm not even listing on that previous slide here. So there's a great deal of interest in these minor cannabinoids. Yet, despite this interest, and despite the fact that people are using these products, we don't really know what their effects are. They haven't been tested thoroughly or at all in some cases for their safety or tolerability, much less their therapeutic potential. And so these minor cannabinoids are of interest, but we know very little. And I'll explain a little bit about what we're doing to help fill that gap in knowledge. In addition to the phytocannabinoids, we know that the cannabis plant has hundreds of terpenes and other chemicals. Terpenes are not unique to the cannabis plant, and you've heard about these terpenes already during this event. Here, I'm just highlighting a couple of the predominant terpenes that are found in the cannabis plant. And for the most part, what we know about these terpenes thus far are related to animal studies and people's report of these terpenes. So here are a couple of interests, and I highlight their potential therapeutic effects. Two terpenes that are of interest in our laboratory are beta-caryophyllene and myrcene, and they're of interest because of the fact that there are preclinical hints that they might be helpful for pain. Now, again, even though these terpenes have not been systematically studied in humans, we see samples of this in dispensaries in the United States, and I'm sure probably in Canada as the market continues to grow. So you can go to dispensaries, or you can even go online and you can get vape cartridges, or you can get tinctures of these isolated terpenes or combinations of terpenes that are thought to produce some type of effect. So the question is, what are the effects of these products that people are using? Are they safe? Are they tolerated? And do they actually have potential therapeutic potential? So those are the individual components, an overview of some of the individual components of the cannabis plant, and ones which are particularly interesting to me. There's this idea that these constituents might be able to work together. And we heard a little bit about this. There was a question during Dr. Piamelli's talk today about this. Can these cannabis constituents work together to essentially enhance the positive effects, the therapeutic effects, and potentially decrease the adverse effects of some of these constituents, namely Delta-9-THC, since we know that a lot of the negative effects of cannabis come from Delta-9-THC. And as Dr. Piamelli said today, we actually know very little about this potential for these constituents to work together, in part because a lot of these constituents haven't been looked at in humans thus far, except for these two, CBD and THC. So there is some evidence that CBD might be helpful in decreasing THC's negative effects, but little is known about how CBD might augment THC's pain relieving effects. And little is known about how these other constituents might be helpful in augmenting THC's effects to perhaps increase the therapeutic effects and decrease the adverse effects. And so today I'll be talking about these individual constituents, about their potential for them to be able to reduce our reliance on or risk of opioids. And I'll be talking about the studies that we have ongoing in our laboratory. And what we do in our laboratory is we look towards what people are actually using in the natural ecology, what they're reporting. For example, people are reporting that CBD is helping them to reduce pain. And then we look at the preclinical literature to see if there are early signals in laboratory animal studies to help guide what we do in our laboratory. The controlled human laboratory is a place where we can give these agents under controlled conditions, compare them to placebo, and assess the potential therapeutic and adverse effects of these constituents, either by themselves or together. This research is guided by laboratory animal studies and informed by epidemiological and observational studies. This is a very controlled environment, and I can go into some of the details later on. But essentially, people come into our laboratory in the morning before they've eaten anything. We give them their breakfast. Their breakfast is standardized across sessions. They use the product that we are interested in assessing. So if it's smoked cannabis, they are not smoking cannabis before they come in, their own cannabis. We ensure that they haven't used cannabis before they come in so that we can look at the effects of the cannabis that we are administering. This is so controlled that we even ask that they put their cell phones away. We have a lockbox where they don't have access to their cell phones so that their mood doesn't change during the course of an 8-hour session based on texts that they're getting from their friends or their parents or their relatives. They don't have access to social media that might impact their mood. They are allowed to have access to some entertainment, but when there are downtimes during the study sessions and they have access to Netflix or Hulu, they're only allowed to watch comedies. So we regulate the content that they can watch. So they're not watching, World War II documentaries, which might have a different impact on their mood. These are double-blind placebo-controlled studies. So we're looking at the active component compared to placebo. In general, because these studies that I'm describing today are the first of their kind in humans, we recruit healthy people because it's important to understand the safety of these products in people who are healthy before looking at their effects in patient populations. And the doses that we choose are generally guided based off of what people are using in the natural ecology. Sometimes we will look to the clinical literature if there has already been a precedent to look at certain doses of certain cannabinoids. And I will say that in the United States, these studies have immense regulatory challenges. So I am a scientist, and I think of myself as doing studies and analyzing data and publishing, but I will say that about at least 30% of my time is really spent dealing with regulatory challenges, if not more. And I know that Canadian researchers face some of these same regulatory challenges. So how do we study pain in a healthy population? So what we do is we induce pain and we look at patients' response before they receive the agent in question and then repeatedly after they receive the agent in question, the study medication. And we do this by using a test called the cold pressor test, where participants first put their hand in warm water to normalize their skin temperature. And then they put their hand in ice cold water, it's 4 degrees Celsius, for up to 3 minutes. And believe it or not, this actually does produce a pain response, except in a select part of the population. People that engage in endurance sports or people who do those polar ice plunges do not seem to be sensitive to this. And it's actually an eligibility criteria in our studies, is that before we admit people into our studies, we have to determine that they are actually sensitive to this pain. So participants put their hand in the ice cold water and we ask them to report when they first feel pain, and that's defined as the pain threshold. And then we time how long they can keep their hand in the ice cold water before they no longer can tolerate it. And that's called pain tolerance. And today I'll be focusing on pain threshold. Now, what I want to call your attention to is that although this is a test where we're giving an acute painful stimulus, it's actually used in the literature and in the field as a predictive test for compounds that might be helpful for chronic pain specifically. So this test actually isn't sensitive necessarily to agents that are helpful for acute pain. So for example, if you give somebody Advil or Tylenol, they will not show a positive signal in this test. But agents that are helpful for chronic pain will show a positive signal in this test. What's nice about this test also is that every person is their own control. So you can imagine that if you brought people into the laboratory, 10 people, every single one of those people are going to have differences in their pain tolerance and pain threshold. There's a great deal of individual variability here. But for this test, we're able to use everybody as their own control. So while looking at their pain response before they get the drug, and then measuring their pain response after they get the drug relative to their baseline is very powerful. And so this is what this effect looks like. So this is a study where we compared smoked cannabis that had THC in it to oral THC. And we were interested to see how the analgesic effects, how the pain relieving effects differ based off of how the THC is administered, inhaled or oral. And this is what happens when you give participants placebo cannabis, so cannabis with no THC, and a placebo capsule, a capsule with no THC in it. And what you can see here, all the way to the left, is their baseline pain threshold, how long participants can keep their hand in the water before reporting that it's painful. And it takes about 15 seconds or 20 seconds before people report that this stimulus is painful. Participants in this study then received an oral capsule that either had placebo or THC, and then 45 minutes later smoked a cannabis cigarette, either placebo or a cannabis cigarette that has THC, and then we started measuring their pain response. And we looked at pain response as a percent of that individual's baseline response. So under placebo conditions, you can see that over 6 hours, participants' pain response did not change from the baseline. But when participants received cannabis, we saw an increase in pain threshold, meaning that participants were able to keep their hand in that ice cold water for significantly longer period of time compared to placebo. And you can see a distinct difference here across routes of administration, where under the smoked cannabis condition, we saw a significant increase in pain threshold immediately after cannabis was smoked, but it quickly went back down to baseline after about 2 hours. In comparison, after people ingested the oral THC, as expected based off of what we know about pharmacokinetics, we saw a delayed onset of the pain relieving properties that peaked around 2 hours and then slowly decreased down to baseline. So we saw that this effect was reliable based off of THC concentration, but it differed based off of the mode of administration. To look at the adverse effects, we usually just ask people to rate on a 100 millimeter line their ratings of how intoxicated they are or how they might be feeling with respect to anxious or sedated. And so here you can see when we ask people to rate their intoxication, we just ask them to say, how high do they feel? And as you can imagine, when we look at differences or the effects of smoked cannabis compared to oral THC, we see an immediate effect after cannabis is smoked that comes back down to baseline after about 3 hours. With the oral THC, the peak for intoxication is delayed, but you also see that the magnitude of effect is not as high. We ask people to tell us about how good of an effect they are having. So this is called abuse liability or misuse liability. And this is a determination of the potential abuse liability that these drugs might have in the natural ecology. And this is something that we generally want to avoid, okay? So if we're looking at a therapeutic agent, we want to see that it has therapeutic potential, but low abuse liability. And so we ask people to rate on a 100 millimeter line their desire to take the drug again and to rate their good drug effect. And what you can see here is that under the smoked cannabis conditions compared to placebo, we see a significant increase of ratings of good effect. This measure of abuse liability after participants smoked 20 milligrams of THC. And when you look at these effects, when 20 milligrams of THC is ingested orally, you don't see a significant increase compared to placebo. So something I want to stress here to summarize is that THC does produce in this model an increase in pain relieving effects, increase in analgesia, but we see that these effects differ across route of administration. So can cannabis reduce reliance on or risk of opioids? So let's talk about THC. If you look at the preclinical, the laboratory animal studies that informs what we do in the laboratory, we know that THC alone elicits what's called an anti-nociceptive effect, an analgesic effect. There seems to be this interesting THC opioid synergy between THC and opioids, such that you can give a small dose of THC that isn't normally analgesic and a small dose of an opioid that isn't normally analgesic, and you put the two together, and then you get analgesia. Interestingly, in some animal models, it looks like THC actually can reduce the abuse potential of opioids using a model called self-administration. So in some studies, if an animal is given THC before an opioid, they won't take as much of that opioid. So we wanted to see if we can look at these effects in the human laboratory. Can THC produce a synergistic effect with opioids? And if so, what type of an effect will THC have on opioid abuse liability? And so for this study, we had 4 dosing conditions. So participants came into our laboratory on 4 different occasions. And on every occasion, they received a capsule, and the capsule either had a placebo, so 0 milligrams, or a very low dose of oxycodone, a known analgesic, but the dose that we used here is lower than the dose that's usually used to produce analgesia. They also smoked a cannabis cigarette, and that cannabis cigarette either had no THC, so 0% THC, or had 30 milligrams of THC. And we wanted to see, again, if the combination of the smoked cannabis with THC in it and the oxycodone would produce a pain relieving response above what you would normally see with the cannabis alone or with the oxycodone alone. And then we were also interested to see if the combination of the two altered the intoxication effects that you would get with one agent given individually, and also to assess abuse liability in the same manner. So does cannabis with THC in it increase opioid analgesia? And so I'm going to show a bar chart of people's percent baseline response. So before people receive the drug, and looking at their pain response after they receive the drug. So the green bar here indicates their percent pain relieving response after smoking cannabis with 30 milligrams of THC. And compared to placebo, we did not see a significant increase in pain tolerance after people smoked cannabis with THC in it. When people received that low dose of oxycodone as expected, because it was such a low dose, we did not see an analgesic effect. But when we looked at the two combined, the smoked cannabis with THC and oxycodone, we saw a significant increase in pain tolerance over what we saw with the placebo condition. So we were able to replicate the synergy that people have reported in preclinical laboratory animals. Now, the question is, if we're seeing this dramatic increase in pain tolerance, will we also see a dramatic increase in intoxication? Will we also see an increase in abuse liability? Two things that would limit the clinical utility of a combination of THC and opioids. So does cannabis intoxication change when combined with an opioid? And so again, we asked people to just rate how high they felt after receiving every study medication and study medication combination. Under placebo conditions, as you can see here, over the course of the session, the 3 hours, participants rated again on a level of 0, not intoxicated at all, to 100, very intoxicated, most intoxicated. Under placebo conditions, participants did not rate feeling intoxicated. Under the cannabis conditions, when they smoked cannabis with 30 milligrams of THC, we saw a significant increase in intoxication, as one would expect. Now, what was interesting is that, again, just a reminder that the oxycodone cannabis combination, we saw increases in the analgesic effects compared to both agent administered alone. So we thought maybe we would see heightened intoxication here as well. But when we looked at the combination of the oxycodone with the smoked cannabis, we did not see a further increase in intoxication. So we saw an increase in the pain relieving effects, but not intoxication. Well, what about opioid abuse liability? Again, if we're looking at a strategy to diminish the adverse effects of opioids, maybe THC can help to reduce some of those adverse effects of opioids. This is the prime adverse effect of interest. What happens when you co-administer THC with an opioid? What we found here, I'm just showing here what happens when we looked at cannabis by itself in the green bars when given with placebo oxycodone, and participants had to rate the good effect, how much they liked the drug, how much they were willing to take that drug again. Okay, so what we see here is that the cannabis does not increase these ratings when compared to the placebo condition where no cannabis is given. When the 2.5 milligrams of oxycodone is administered with placebo cannabis, we don't see any change. So the 2.5 milligrams of oxycodone does not produce these abuse liability ratings. And the cannabis does not produce these ratings when we're asking people, how much did you like that capsule that might have had the opioid? But when we do the combination, when we look at the combination of smoked cannabis with THC plus oxycodone, we saw a significant enhancement of these abuse liability ratings. There were modest increases, but they were still significantly different from placebo and from the other drug conditions. So to summarize, we know from population studies that it seems like people from medical cannabis stage show a reduction in opioid use. We know from preclinical studies that there is evidence for this cannabinoid THC opioid synergy, such that THC can decrease opioid self-administration, but also increase the pain relieving effects of small doses of opioids. Here, what I'm showing you is that there does seem to be clinical evidence, at least in our healthy population, that inhaled THC in the form of cannabis with THC, it might be helpful to reduce the opioid dose needed to achieve pain relief. However, in this small study, it looks like it might also increase the abuse liability of the opioid, something that we would want to avoid. So these were promising studies that warranted further direction, further investigation, and I'll talk a little bit about where we're going from here. But I also want to note that there was a recent study looking at oral THC administration with opioids that found something different. It's really important that we take note of this because we already know that mode of administration is important. So the more recent study looked at a group of 10 people and found that oral THC also increased opioid abuse liability, but did not have an effect on opioid pain relief. In fact, in some tests that they ran, it might have actually decreased opioid analgesia. So this shows you that mode of administration really matters when looking at this interaction. Well, what about other cannabis constituents? So here we just talked about THC. So let's talk a little bit about cannabidiol, CBD. As I've already mentioned, people report that CBD is helpful for pain. In fact, 50% of pain patients using CBD enriched extracts report that they're able to decrease their opioid use. We know from randomized clinical trials where CBD is compared to placebo that in chronic pain patients, CBD was able to decrease pain. Now, I want to emphasize that this has been shown with only one study thus far. Other studies done since then have not been able to show this effect. I will say that other studies that have combined CBD and THC seem to show that the combination might be helpful in reducing pain in chronic pain population. Now, interestingly, so there's this question about how CBD might be helpful for pain. Well, what role can it play when we're thinking about how to improve the safety profile of opioids? So we know that one study demonstrated that CBD can decrease anxiety and craving in people with opioid use disorder. It's possible that CBD might be helpful in reducing opioid abuse liability. And those studies have not yet been done yet in humans. In animal models, there's quite a bit of interesting literature that points to this potential for CBD to help augment the adverse effects of opioids. We know that CBD alone can reduce pain in animal models and a variety of pain models. We know that in some situations, there's a CBD opioid synergy, just like there is with THC. And we know that in some animal models, CBD can decrease abuse-related quality of opioids. So to summarize, people self-report that they use CBD for pain. CBD might reduce factors that contribute to opioid use or opioid abuse liability in opioid use dependent populations. And there seems to be some preclinical support for CBD's potential for pain and opioid synergy. But again, I just want to stress that we actually know very little at this point based off of randomized controlled trials about how CBD might be helpful by itself for pain. So first, let's talk about if CBD can decrease the pain response. And then let's talk about if it's able to augment THC's analgesic effects. So going back to some of the earlier slides where I was talking about how there might be some therapeutic potential in combining CBD and THC. There's some evidence that CBD might be helpful in reducing some of the adverse effects of THC. Well, can CBD combined with THC increase analgesic effects and decrease abuse liability? So here I'll be talking about a study where we looked at vaporized cannabis with different amounts of CBD and THC. So under 4 dosing conditions, we brought people in for 4 different sessions. One session, participants received vaporized cannabis with no THC and no CBD in it. On another session, participants vaporized cannabis with 25 milligrams of THC, another one with 25 milligrams of CBD, but no THC. And then we looked at the combination, and we looked at the effects on pain and abuse liability and intoxication. So this study is funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse and was carried out at Columbia. We got the grant when I was still at Columbia, and then it had to be carried out at Columbia under Dr. Arut's administration. So I'm very grateful for Caroline Arut, who's at Columbia now. She's an assistant professor for spearheading this study. And what we found, similar to what I showed you before, is that under placebo conditions where people vaporized cannabis with no THC and no CBD, there was no change in pain threshold over time. When we looked at the cannabis type with 25 milligrams of CBD in it, we did not see any difference compared to placebo. These are early studies. We've only done this in 10 people thus far. And these findings might change, but we do not see a hint that CBD, when inhaled, when vaporized, produces an analgesic effect in this model, in the cold presser test. When we looked at cannabis with 25 milligrams of THC, we did see a slight increase in pain threshold immediately after people used that cannabis. And this came back down to baseline very quickly. Now, what happened when we combined the cannabis with THC and with CBD? What we found was an impressive increase in pain threshold that really peaked what we had seen earlier under any of our other study medication conditions in the past. So we saw a kind of synergistic effect, if you will, again, very small n thus far, but we saw that the combination of THC and CBD increased pain threshold in this population. So does CBD also increase THC intoxication? So this is what we found for intoxication under the CBD only condition. The open triangles are placebo, the closed triangles are 25 milligrams of CBD. And what we found is that CBD itself did not produce intoxication. One curious thing I want to point out here is that these ratings of intoxication under placebo conditions are higher than what we usually see. And we think this might be because this was a novel way of using cannabis in this population. They were using this Mighty Medic, a vaporizer, a handheld vaporizer that the participants had not used before. So there might have been a expectancy effect here under the placebo condition. Under the THC condition, after participants vaporized 25 milligrams of THC, you can see that there was a significant increase in intoxication. And when you combine THC plus CBD, you saw the same level of intoxication that we saw with the THC by itself. So although THC and CBD combination increased pain relieving effects, we did not see an increase in intoxication. What about abuse liability? Again, I want to point out something interesting here, that under the placebo condition, when participants were asked to rate how good of an effect they felt when they vaporized cannabis with no THC and no CBD, we saw this striking increase here that we don't usually see under smoked cannabis conditions. But the CBD condition did not increase this abuse liability rating. We saw some mild THC abuse liability ratings here, more sustained than what we see under the CBD only condition. But when we use the two combined, THC plus CBD, we saw a further enhancement of this rating of good effect. So to summarize, CBD in this study under vaporized conditions seems to lack the analgesic effects on its own. But when combined with THC, it seems to increase THC-induced analgesia. This enhancement of THC analgesia does not generalize to intoxication, but it does seem like CBD increases THC abuse liability. So we're looking at this further, and we have a self-administration model where we're looking to see if people will opt to use the cannabis with the CBD and THC combined more than just the THC alone. So interestingly, we don't hear about much of this in the literature, but there is one study showing that inhaled CBD does increase some of the negative effects of THC, which people should be made aware of. So the question here is, will CBD and THC we already showed you how it can increase the analgesic effects when compared to THC by itself. Will it further enhance opioid analgesia? And what will it do to the abuse liability of opioids? And we have that study underway. In fact, it's just about ready to wrap up, and we'll be showing some of those results at CPDD in June. So CBG is another minor cannabinoid of interest. CBG in animal models lacks that cannabinoid psychoactivity that Delta-9-THC has. It has pain relieving properties in animal models. And interestingly, the mechanism of action of CBG differs from THC. So it does not act at the CB1 receptor to produce its pain relieving effects. And so that provides some intriguing question about if CBG might be helpful in people for pain. And if it is it possible that it doesn't have those adverse effects of THC that are linked to the CB1 receptor mechanism of action? What do we know in people? It hasn't been studied yet in people. We know that CBG naturally occurs in cannabis at concentrations that are high enough to likely have some effect, but we have yet to find out if this effect that we see in animals translates to humans. And so this is what we're doing now. We're looking at CBG by itself in combinations with THC, and the doses that we're using for CBG and the mode of administration is comparable to what people are using in the natural ecology. So we're using inhaled CBG and inhaled THC over 9 sessions. And we're looking at CBG by itself, again, at concentrations, 10 and 30 milligrams, that people are normally exposed to in the natural ecology, because this is the first time that we're giving this to people. So we want to make sure that we're in a safe threshold. And we're comparing CBG by itself to THC by itself. And then we're going to look at the different dose conditions to see if CBG can augment the pain relieving effects of THC. And if so, how would it impact the adverse effects of THC? So we have this study that's already up and running. We're really excited for it, as well as studies looking at 2 select terpenes, beta-caryophyllene and myrcene. As I mentioned before, there are some pain patient reports suggesting that beta-caryophyllene and myrcene might be helpful for pain. So pain patients choose cannabis varieties that are high in these 2 types of terpenes. In fact, 1/3 of this patient population substituted this type of cannabis for opioids. In animal models, both myrcene and beta-caryophyllene reduce pain in some pain models. And these analgesic effects have very limited behavioral effects. And so that gives us promise that these are 2 terpenes that might produce analgesic effects with limited adverse effects. There's also some interesting evidence showing that beta-caryophyllene, BCP, synergizes with opioids, similar to what I showed you before with THC, such that you can use a very small dose of an opioid that doesn't produce adverse effects and doesn't really produce analgesia on its own. But when you put it together with beta-caryophyllene, you see significant pain relief or analgesic effects in animal models without the adverse effects. Beta-caryophyllene has also been shown recently to decrease some of the abuse-related effects of other drugs, such as alcohol, opioids, and cocaine. So we see that there are patient-reported effects of these terpenes suggesting that they might have clinical potential. And there's some nice preclinical support for terpenes to be able to produce analgesic effects on their own and perhaps decrease the adverse effects of THC and opioid doses. And so we currently have one big study underway where we're looking at both of these terpenes, myrcene by itself, beta-caryophyllene by itself, comparing the two THCs, pain relieving effects and adverse effects, and then looking at the combinations of these different terpenes with THC to see if these terpenes have effects on their own and if they can help to enhance THC pain relieving effects and perhaps decrease some of the adverse effects. So to summarize, I presented some interesting data to suggest that there are cannabis constituents beyond Delta-9-THC that might have potential for having pain relieving effects and potentially to reduce our reliance on opioids and might be safer strategies than, let's say, Delta-9-THC that has adverse effects. Controlled studies are absolutely necessary to understand how these constituents might decrease or exacerbate opioid risks. So we hear a lot about how cannabis might be helpful to reduce the opioid epidemic, the opioid burden, but these controlled studies are really necessary for people to understand the safety, tolerability, and effectiveness of these constituents when thinking about using them in addition to opioids or even by themselves. And so I welcome you to learn more about what we're up to at UCLA. And I'd like to thank my collaborators and the audience members for listening today. And I'd be happy to take any comments.
Thank you very much for that great presentation. So many questions to try and answer. For now, there's look like a question and a comment in the question and answer section. The question from Jacqueline is, what is a placebo cannabis? In a low THC plant, would there not be increased CBD and CBG, and there would be terpenes, all of which can affect pain?
Yeah, these are great questions. And as a pharmacologist, it's really important to strive to get the most pure, right? So I'm interested in understanding each of these individual agents and how they act when you combine them. So our placebo cannabis comes from the farm in Mississippi that many of you have heard about, where we can get cannabis that is federally compliant. And they produce placebo cannabis that is essentially stripped of THC and has very low levels, if not zero levels, of these other minor cannabinoids and terpenes. When I showed you the studies that we're doing with CBG, cannabigerol, as well as the terpenes, we're so crazy about the pharmacology here and about the purity of our findings that we're actually using completely isolated compounds. So people are vaporizing isolated THC or isolated CBG and isolated terpenes so that we can look at these individual constituents by themselves and then together to help improve our understanding about how these chemicals might interact. When you look at cannabis that you can get from the dispensary, it produces kind of like a messy picture, right? Because there's all kinds of other constituents in those cannabis varieties, and it's hard to pinpoint when you get an effect, what chemical that effect can be responsible for that observation. So it's really important to try and be as controlled as possible for these first ever in human studies. Of course, people aren't necessarily using the products like this, right? But these studies will help to inform what we know about the potential therapeutic effects of cannabis and cannabinoids.
Jacqueline follows up with a comment observation. It would be interesting to look at higher ratios of CBD to THC, as this may decrease the side effects and abuse liability, as that seems to be the case clinically.
It would be. Now, so when we talk about what's the case clinically, right? So people have a great deal of experience. They talk to patients, they have their own experience, right? And this is their own experience and patient reports about what happens when people use higher CBD to THC ratios. And we're trying our best to keep up with what people are reporting and test those things out. Right now, right, we're using just a 1-to-1. But in the future, it will be really interesting to play around with these ratios and figure out if CBD at higher ratios might be able to augment some of the adverse effects. Also, just keep in mind that mode of administration is really important here. So what I'm showing you here, where we saw increases in abuse liability and increases in analgesic effects, that's only under the inhaled condition. It's interesting that there's been another study looking at inhaled CBD and THC that suggests that under inhaled conditions, CBD might change how THC is metabolized, the pharmacokinetics of THC, such that when inhaled, CBD, the presence of CBD increases THC blood levels. And so that might be what we're seeing here. And we're following up on drawing blood to look at blood levels after people inhale THC and CBD and compare that to oral administration, because the pharmacokinetics might be quite different, which has important clinical outcomes and clinical ramifications.
So I think that kind of answers Colleen's question, which is next. Can you please confirm the statement that CBD can reduce the impairment negative side effects of THC? This is what I have heard read often, but I think you said smoked high CBD containing THC cannabis can increase the negative side effects of THC.
That's what our study showed, right? And another 2 studies showed that under vaporized and smoke conditions, it seems like THC's effects might be enhanced with cannabidiol. Now, other studies looking at intravenous THC administration and oral THC administration have shown that CBD, it might be helpful in reducing some of the adverse effects of THC. I think I said that right, such as the psychotic-like inducing effects, memory impairing effects. And this effect has also been shown in preclinical studies, so in laboratory animal studies. So there's a lot to unpack here, right? We hear frequently that CBD might be helpful in reducing the harms of THC, but we're starting to see that the story is a little bit more complicated than I think what we originally thought.
Question from Miriam. Have sex-dependent effects been examined in the presented studies on pain, namely the studies on single THC administration and co-administration of THC with low doses of oxycodone?
Great question. So our lab is interested in the sex-dependent effects of cannabis and cannabinoids. We have a very large study right now just looking at sex-dependent effects of abuse liability and pain-relieving effects of THC, just THC. We're recruiting 120 completers for that study. So we're recruiting 240 people to get 120 completers. That's a huge undertaking. In these studies where we're looking at these minor cannabinoids and terpenes alone and then in combination, we strive to recruit 50% males and 50% females, but we might not have the power to be able to say that there are strong sex-dependent effects that we can really hang our hat on. And I think that this is a next step, right? So we know very little about CBD's sex-dependent effects in humans, even though CBD is very popularly used. We don't have good studies from controlled drug administration procedures to say that men or women are more sensitive to one effect of CBD versus another. And this is a very understudied area that requires a great deal of investigation, also a great deal of funds to actually tease this apart. It's something that we strive for, but we don't have good evidence yet to suggest that males or females are more sensitive to the effects of these constituents.
Question from Tony George. Are there confounding effects of tobacco/nicotine vaping in these pain responses to CBD, THC, and terpenes? In your model of vaporized THC CBD, you mentioned there might be expectancy effects to explain the high baseline behavioral ratings. Would a training session before these vaporized administration studies help lower these high baseline subjective ratings?
That's a great question, Dr. George. Thank you. So it might, but one thing I want to remind the audience of is that the dose order was randomized here. So when people receive the placebo condition, it could have been their last session, right? Or it could have been their third session. It could have been a session when they've already been exposed to this handheld vaporizer and vaporizing in a way that they haven't normally done before. And so I think that a training session might help to reduce this expectancy effect. It'll be interesting. But one thing I also want to point out is that although we saw high subjective ratings under placebo conditions, you'll notice that that didn't generalize to the pain relieving effects, demonstrating the power of a placebo-controlled study and the need to have a placebo because there could be expectancy, but that expectancy did not generalize to the potential therapeutic endpoint of interest, suggesting that what we're seeing with the active study drug is powerful. It goes beyond the placebo effect. It goes beyond expectancy, which is important. With respect to tobacco and nicotine, I think that this is a really interesting question to look at and something that we try to control for in our studies. Generally speaking, at least the studies that we have running at UCLA right now, very few people are endorsed e-cig use or tobacco smoking, but that is not an exclusion criteria. We do make sure that nobody has used the e-cigarette or at least nobody has smoked cannabis before, smoked cigarettes before they come in. We look at carbon monoxide levels. But it is something that's very important to control for, since, nicotine is a pharmacological agent. It has impacts on subjective ratings and pain response as well. So it's an important question to query and an important feature to control for in these studies.
The next question, in your studies looking at abuse liability, what kind of self-administration paradigm / choice task would you use to measure participants' choice to administer more of the product containing THC versus CBD versus combination?
So I didn't go into this in much detail, actually in any detail in this presentation, just for the sake of time, but we use a validated self-administration measure that we've used in our laboratory before, where we simply ask people to pay attention when they're using the cannabis, when they're administered the cannabis in the morning, pay attention to how it makes them feel, because in the afternoon, they actually have an opportunity to use their study earnings to purchase puffs of what they smoked that morning. And so in this particular study, where we're looking at CBD and THC and how CBD might impact the abuse liability of THC and opioids in the long term, we actually tell people that they can purchase a puff for $2 of their study earnings, up to 4 puffs. Now, keep in mind, they're about to leave the laboratory, so they only have 3 hours left of the session, and they're about to go home and smoke their own cannabis, not our government grade cannabis. So why would they choose to use up to $8 of their study earnings to smoke 4 puffs of what they're using in the morning? The only conclusion I can make is that, there is abuse liability to this cannabis, and they enjoy it. They like it enough to spend up to $8 of their own study earnings of the cannabis for the cannabis they smoked that morning. And indeed, what we've found thus far is that under placebo conditions, the placebo cannabis with no THC, no CBD, and the cannabis with CBD, people won't really self-administer it. People won't pay for extra puffs in the afternoon. With the THC cannabis and the cannabis with combined THC and CBD, they will. So they will self-administer more puffs in the afternoon. They will spend their study earnings to actually smoke the cannabis that we're giving them in the lab. And so it's the gold standard way of looking at abuse liability, is actually giving people the opportunity to use the drug at some cost. And the cost here is the actual study earnings.
Great. Thank you. James, I'll pass it back to you.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Ziva. That was so illuminating. I'm sort of intrigued by not only cannabigerol, but also, was it beta-caryophyllene? I don't think I had any sense that there was so much promise there. Very exciting work.
Yeah. A lot of preclinical studies have been looking at beta-caryophyllene. It's a CB2 receptor agonist, and so it's thought to mediate the abuse liability of other drugs because of the CB2 receptor activity.
So interesting. Thank you so much. All right, well, that brings us to the end of our last keynote and to some final concluding remarks on our meeting this year. It's been an incredibly rich selection of talks, in my opinion. I once again am very much inspired by the breadth of investigation that's happening and just the richness of the field of cannabis research. We have seen findings from basic pharmacology and biochemistry. We've seen rodent models and brain imaging studies, the impact of cannabis on neuropsychological outcomes, findings from randomized controlled trials, and cannabis through the lens of evidence-based medicine. And I think that what we really can not avoid concluding is that the study of cannabis can only happen with this level of interdisciplinarity and with a kind of compound eye of science, using these many different lenses to understand not only risks, but also benefits and the balance of the two together. I was also reminded over the past 3 days of some of the challenges that the field faces still scientifically and on the regulatory front. I think that as we learn more about the endocannabinoid system and the cannabis plant, it's more and more clear that anandamide and 2-AG are not the only compounds we need to fully understand, but also FA and MAGL for that matter. And THC and CBD may be the cannabinoids we're most familiar with, but clearly there's a full panoply of cannabinoids that are biologically active and in a number of cases show great promise, as we just heard today, when it comes to analgesia, when it comes to anti-anxiety effects. So again, it's not a matter of a single compound or molecule like nicotine or the cocaine alkaloid. It's a real category or rubric of molecules we're interested in here. The other thing that occurred to me as a common through line is just how critical route of administration is and how different the impacts can be when the drug is consumed orally versus via inhalation, versus topically. And so really there are many different factors to consider. The other consideration is just how challenging it can be to do this work. And I think that what we heard from Canadian scientists and US scientists was that it is not easy to do cannabis research, and it's easy to have an opinion. It's hard to get the data. And that means getting cannabis research licenses. It means getting clinical trial applications approved. It means in the US navigating the disconnect often between federal and state laws. The reality is that we need more evidence. We need it from randomized controlled trials. We need it from well-conducted human laboratory studies like the ones Dr. Cooper was just presenting. And I think that to the extent our federal, provincial, or state supporters can facilitate this happening by minimizing the regulatory burden on investigators should really happen. I do think that the road ahead is exciting. Certainly for the DeGroote Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research, we have a lot to be optimistic about despite the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. There are multiple trials that are now poised to launch with approved cannabis research licenses and either CTAs or pending approval or product pending arrival. We've just finished enrollment on a Vanguard study using neuroeconomics to understand the reinforcing value of cannabis, which is very exciting. A number of projects on cannabis use in the context of pregnancy and women's health are coming to fruition using both preclinical and clinical methods. And we're also getting some very exciting data in from our internal analyses of cannabis constituents using our new analytics license. So I think that despite many disruptions from the COVID-19 pandemic, many of our initiatives have been delayed, but nonetheless are proceeding, and hopefully we'll have updates on those fronts in 2023. The other thing that's happening in 2023 that is kind of remarkable is that it will be the 5-year anniversary of cannabis legalization in Canada. And we will be organizing our conference around that anniversary in order to once again take stock of this momentous shift in the legal framework in Canada and what the impacts have been for medical cannabis users, for recreational cannabis users, and how legalization may or may not have interacted with the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to thank all of our presenters again for extremely stimulating talks and all of our participants and registrants for attending the conference. We very much appreciate your participation in this undertaking, and stay tuned for more findings, and we hope you join us again next year. Thank you.